Okay, today we are going to introduce complex numbers. Now in the Springboard textbook, this is lessons 8.1, 8.2, so that's kind of what you're seeing at the top of the paper. But I know you don't have your books, but I'm going to get everything out of the book and give you some examples right here for us to learn. So a complex number is a number of the form a plus bi. So I'm just reading this right here, where a is your real part and the bi is the imaginary part. So far to this point, in all of your algebra classes, you've dealt with real numbers. So now we're going to throw in a complex number, which just means it can have a real part and an imaginary part. Now, where does the imaginary unit come from? Well, basically it comes from when you have a negative under a square root. And that's defined, so right here, the square root of -1 is defined to be I. And then if you square both sides, like I'm not going to really do it, but if I were to take the square root of -1, and if I were to square that, take it and square it, and then I squared the I, the square root and the squared would cancel each other, which then leaves us the fact that -1 is equal to I squared. So I've got two new pieces of information right here. The square root of -1 is I, and -1 is equal to I squared. And that's important a little later on when we start simplifying with complex numbers. So keep that in mind. That's our imaginary unit. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify these radicals and leave our answer in terms of I. So we know, like when I teach this typically, I show the fact that this would be 25 times -1. I mean, that's how you get -25. I know the square root of 25 is 5. But in this lesson, we're learning that the square root of a -1 is defined to be I. So this square root of -1 right here would be I. So the entire square root of -25 is just 5i. Now number 2, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say 7 times -1. Okay, but I know I can't take the square root of 7. 7 is nowhere near a perfect square, but I can take the square root of -1. So the only thing I can bring out of this is an I. So my definition up here, square root of -1 is I. So I'm going to bring an I out, but I'm going to leave the 7 right where it is under the radical. So it's I radical 7. Okay, now we're getting into some that they can be simplified a little bit more than what we did on number 2. So when I break this one apart, I look at this as 4 times 3 times -1, because I want to, when I'm simplifying a 12, I want to get the largest perfect square number that can divide into 12, and that's going to be the 4. So I know 4 times 3 is 12. And then the negative piece, is what makes it a -12. And that's what's going to give me my I. Now the only part of this I can simplify is the square root of 4. And I can take the square root of -1. So the square root of 4 is going to be 2. I'm going to jump over the 3 because I can't do anything with that. The square root of negative 1 is I. And then the only thing that's left under the radical is that 3. So that's as simple as I can get it. 2I radical 3. Okay, now this one has a negative out in front. So I'm going to leave that where it is. Okay, don't make those two negatives create a positive. Now I'm going to think of a perfect square that goes into 150. The largest perfect square would be 25. So I'm going to do 25 times 6 times negative 1. So once again, I can simplify the square root of 25 and the square root of negative 1. So this will be negative. So the square root of 25 is 5. And nothing with the 6. Okay, the 6 can't be broke down any more than it is. And then the square root of negative 1 is your I. So go back though and pick up the 6 because we didn't do anything with it. It's still under the radical. And then put that in your answer. Okay, now this one's got 4 minus the square root of negative 20. So I'm just going to kind of keep on, top of that 4 minus and just leave it right there. I am going to simplify the negative 20 under the radical. So once again, I'm going to think of the largest perfect square, which is 4. So if I do 4 times 5 times negative 1, I always know, when you see a negative like under all these radicals, you know your answer is going to have an I in it. I'm just breaking it down so you can see, the base of why it is an I, because there's my square root of negative 1. So kind of like on the previous two, I can take the square root of 4 and I can take the square root of negative 1. I can't do anything more with the 5. And remember, we had that 4 minus. So I'm going to do 4 minus. The square root of 4 is 2. That's going to come out. The square root of negative 1 is I. That's going to come out. And I'm just going to leave that 5 right where it is, under the radical. Now I cannot subtract these two. These are unlike terms. There's nothing more I can do right here. Okay, we're going to do one more in this video. Oops. So this one looks similar to number 5. I'm going to keep the negative 3 plus. Okay, now 81 is a perfect square. Like, none of these previous ones, the 3 that we've just done, I guess, 3 in a row, number 3, 4, 5, we didn't have any perfect squares. Before that, back on number 1, we did. So I kind of left that as 25. I didn't have to break that down. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I know 81 is a perfect square. And times negative 1. So I'm going to be able to simplify, both of these. And if you guys, during class, if you get to these videos, you want me to write some of the perfect squares on the board, I can maybe write up the first 10 or 15 perfect squares if you're not confident or comfortable with your perfect square list. So that's going to be a 9. And then the square root of negative 1 is I. Okay, I'll be back shortly to finish the rest of this worksheet. See you later.